Welcome to the first episode in a podcast series on Open Wide Our Hearts, the 2018 U.S. Bishop's Pastoral Letter addressing racism. This is season 4 of our parish podcast, Viz on Main. Today's unedited episode is a recording of my conversation with a chosen cross-section of professionals, all of whom have a connection to Visitation and who, having read the bishop's letter, are willing to discuss their responses. I'm Lorraine Gordon, a member of the Faith Formation team and your host at Viz on Main. Now I'm going to ask each of our participants to begin by briefly describing his or her connection to Visitation and professional calling. I think I will begin with Sandy.
Okay, well, I'm Sandy Midkiff. I have been a parishioner at Visitation since 1989, and in my professional life, I was and am a practicing attorney, and I was a circuit court judge for 18 years and retired from the court last year. So that's my professional life, and my family life is that I am married, widowed, and have 2 adult children.
Okay, thank you, Sandy. Mm-hmm. Emmet, would you be willing to introduce yourself to our listening audience?
Absolutely. Good evening. My name is Emmet Pierson Jr., and my connection to Visitation is I went to Visitation from 1975 to 1980. I was the only African-American at the time in the school. And so I had some good experiences overall. I am married to a St. Teresa's girl, Dr. Marion Pearson, and we have 2 wonderful children. And I am president CEO of the Community Builders of Kansas City, which is a not-for-profit doing urban economic development and redevelopment on Kansas City's east side and in underserved communities.
Thanks, Emmet. Nancy?
My name is Nancy Hess. My connection with Visitation is that I currently teach first grade at Visitation. I have taught there for 20 plus years. And I am married with 2 daughters, a senior and a 6th grader.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. Kara.
I am Kara Bemboom Grefrath. My connection to Visitation is that I've been a parishioner for nearly 20 years. I was married at Visitation to my husband, Sam Grefrath. He and I continue to be active parishioners, and we have 2 young sons, Hank, who is 6, and Crosby, who is 3.5. A half is very important at that age.
Okay, thank you very much. Father Brad.
Yeah, I'm Monsignor or Father, whatever, Brad Offutt, and I try to be the pastor of Visitation Parish now for 5 years, 7 months, and 9 days. And that's mostly consists of, at least at Visitation, of trying to hold the center together. And in the current climate, that's a frequently challenging thing to do. I've been a priest in this diocese for almost 36 years, and it's certainly been a wild ride.
Okay, all right, thank you. And then finally, well, not finally, but John, would you mind introducing yourself?
You bet. Hi, everybody. My name's John Santner. I've been a member of Visitation Church for about 30 years. I think most people probably knew my counterpart, Beatrice Flo, who was a choir director who passed in 2014. I am currently single with 2 children, but I recently got engaged, so that's exciting. And my professional career ended happily of August of last year. I was a regional vice president for a not-for-profit group called NeighborWorks America, and we were a support group for CDC's Community Development Corporations, like the one Emmet is running currently. And we had about 55 groups in our portfolio of 13 states and provided grant money and training to all of these groups, many of whom were Center City. So this particular topic, especially after the murder of George Floyd, was front and center and was very emotionally discussed over a period of 2 years that I was there.
I can imagine, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, and then finally, Joanne, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Joanne Axtell, and I'm a member of the Faith Formation team and the Racial Justice Committee. And I just wanted to thank you all for being here tonight. This is really an important project to both Faith Formation and our Racial Justice Committee. And I know we've had to send lots of emails, and it's been kind of an ordeal to get it scheduled, but thank you for working with us on this.
Okay, thanks for everybody for those introductions. I want us to spend just a moment reflecting on a quote from the bishop's letter, which incorporates excerpts from St. Paul's letters to the Corinthians. And this is the quote. The love of Christ impels us to see others as our brothers and sisters. If one part suffers, all parts suffer with it. It is the love of Christ that binds the church together, and this love reaches out beyond the church to all peoples. This love also requires justice. So having taken a moment to hear those words and reflect on what those verses mean, I want to move on to the questions that we'd like to discuss this evening. The first question is, as you read the letter, what 2 or 3 passages stood out to you? And I'm going to begin by asking Kara to start that conversation.
Thank you. I realized I forgot to list my occupation. I, like Sandy, am a lawyer by trade, and I practice in-house at a large financial services organization here in town.
Okay, thanks.
So I was struck by this letter, and really 2 things sort of stood out to me most. And one is a passage, and the other might seem kind of silly. This might make you regret having me on this podcast. The first is the date. I was a little bit surprised to see that this had been issued in 2018, a year and a half before the murder of George Floyd and some of the racial injustice reckoning that our country has been facing. And I was struck by just the overall strong tone of the letter, particularly in light of that timing. And I was honestly a little bit surprised in a good way at the strength and the tone of the document. But the part that really stood out to me was the idea that, and I think this is particularly true and has become more in the forefront, at least of my mind, over the last couple of years, which is the idea that there's a sentence on at least my copy, page 7, where it says, in this regard, each of us should adopt the words of Pope Francis as our own. Let no one think that this invitation is not meant for him or her. All of us are in need of personal and ongoing conversion. I thought that was really powerful, because I think that there was a time maybe in our country, in our church, in our neighborhood, in circles, where an issue like this didn't seem like it was the responsibility of each one of us. And I am somewhat heartened by the idea that this personal responsibility has come to each of us in a way that maybe it didn't before. And I felt like this letter in some way sort of got to and made that become a little bit more clear, and was at least sort of really upfront about it. The other thing that I felt like really spoke to me was a passage where it says, although our nation has moved forward in a number of ways against racial discrimination, we've lost ground in others. And I don't know, again, going back to the timing, how true that could be. Despite significant progress in civil law with regard to racism, societal realities indicate a need to facilitate further conversion of hearts, too many good people remain unaware of the connection between institutional racism and the continued erosion of the sanctity of life. I thought, and this one sentence sort of later in the paragraph said, God demands more of us. I don't know, again, I was just sort of struck by this urgent call to action. And I don't know that I felt like all of the actions were particularly specific enough for what I think we need to do, and I don't know that it went far enough, but I did think I was appreciative sort of as a Catholic that it was that forceful to say we are required to do more, and that there was this idea that, at least on some level, accountability for racial injustice lies within each of us, and that each of us need to look inside and think about this sort of listening, this conversion of heart, and this commitment to have hard conversations and to really do more.
Thank you. I really appreciate that insight and that response. Father Brad, what about you?
Yeah, I at least this time reading through it, was especially struck by this paragraph. It's about 8 lines long, so I'll read it if you don't mind.
Don't mind at all.
To walk humbly with God requires even more. We know that we don't have all the answers, but a missionary disciple is one who willingly meets every problem and every sinful attitude with the confidence that comes from a deep love of Jesus. As Pope Benedict XVI has said, being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive action. Benedict very often says the most profound things in the most deceptively simple way. And that's what he's doing here. I think that for many people, God starts out as an idea, a theory that we employ to explain our experience. You know, God is somebody born in a crib a long time ago. God is a man who died on a cross a long time ago. God is an old man with a flowing white beard who stands way up in the skies looking down on the world. But I don't like the word justice. I think it gets in the way. What we're talking about here is a matter of love. And you can't really begin to love in a way that meets the issue of racism until God becomes relational. You know, God becomes personal to me, and is not just an idea in a book or a notion in my head. So I liked that insight. I believe in it. I think it's foundational to the whole thing.
Okay, thank you for expounding on that one paragraph.
I thought that's what I was supposed to do.
You are. We are. We're glad you did it. Anyone else want to share his or her passage, or a particular theme or something that really struck you as you were reading? Anyone else?
Sure. This is Emmet, and it really comes down for me to a passage that is on page 6, and it says, "We are meant to love God with our whole being, which then overflows into love for our neighbor. Whoever loves God must love his brother." I mean, that's the basic essence of, if you love God, if you truly love God, then you love your neighbor. And if you love your neighbor, then in theory, we won't have some of the issues that this country has been experiencing for over many centuries.
Okay, thank you, Emmet. Someone else want to comment?
This is Nancy.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me in several passages, I don't know if I had one specific, but it kind of ran through, is kind of holding that looking glass up to yourself, and that you have to acknowledge the bias within yourself on a kind of continual basis. And so it talked about how, we all have those inherent prejudices and biases within ourselves, and we have to be willing to acknowledge them and be brave enough to say, yes, this is what I grew up in, and to not just kind of white sweep it under the rug. And as Emmet was saying, you love your neighbor as yourself, but you have to acknowledge that this is what I also, you know, if I grew up with this, and I'm going to just say, oh, well, that didn't really matter. And then the other thing that is one of the things that I've struggled with in talking with, I know people in my family and things like that, is this concept of institutional racism. And they addressed that, I thought, really well in this, is that I've had some interesting conversations with older members in my family who are like, since they don't see the overt racism, they think everything's better now. And trying to explain that institutional racism is still there. And so I like that was addressed in this, and that is still something that needs to be looked at.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Does anyone else want to comment about passages that struck them? Well, if not, we can move on to the next question then. Again, did anything in this letter as you read it challenge you? And if it did, how so? How did it challenge you, if, you know, given all that it contains? What challenged you and how? And I'm going to begin with Sandy.
You're muted.
Thank you. I was safeguarding against my dog speaking before me, so pardon me for that. I was challenged in this by the boldness of two statements. One was the reference to racism comes in the form of the sin of omission, when individuals, communities, and even churches remain silent. And in our community, in Brookside, and in Visitation Parish, and in our own very comfortable lives in this setting, I'm totally challenged by that. And it's this made me feel just terribly complacent. Even though I feel like I'm not, I try to do things to reach out, to seek out a worship community that is integrated, to engage in people in our Catholic faith in other communities and other parishes that are more diverse and more racially integrated. For me, that has been a big challenge in my own life. And one of the things that I feel like I can do, because I feel, as Father Brad pointed out here, that it is God's love and love that compels us to reach out. And, you know, none of us can ever do enough politically, I think, to whatever we do, to speak out or to be politically active. That one person's voice in that respect, it feels just so inadequate, and just one voice in many. But I do think that the bottom line of what I came away from the most was how personal the challenge is here, to not be silent in the face of racism, and to engage and to create friendships and loving relationships with people who are not, for me, for people who are not just like me, to be proud of my friendships that cross racial and ethnic lines, and to have strong friendships and loving relationships with people who are not just like me. And I'm very proud of that. And I try to live in that. And even though I'm never as politically active or effective as I wish I were, I feel like the challenge to respond in love and to make sure that I'm connecting I'm bridging with people not just like me is the biggest challenge that I come back to and that I receive from this. And I feel like that challenge is really here with Visitation, that it's very, very sad that Visitation is so homogeneous, so white as a glass of milk. And it really saddens me greatly. And it's a big challenge for our parish, I think, is to find ways to be more engaged, to be more open, and to build bridges with other communities and other people.
Thank you, Sandy.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. Okay, John, how about you? What challenged you?
Thanks, Lorraine. I enjoy history, and I appreciate that the document tried to take somewhat of a limited historic approach. And I guess the passage that struck me was this one here. Even though subsequent popes strongly renounced and rejected the international slave trade, much to our shame, many American religious leaders, including Catholic bishops, failed to formally oppose slavery. Some even owned slaves. You know, as I read the document overall, I thought, wow, man, the church can really knock it out of the park. And kind of like Kara, I was surprised that it was in 2018 because I had never read the document before. And maybe shame on me, but I didn't know it existed. I feel about the document overall, it states wonderful aspirational goals, but I feel the same way. And I was on 2 years worth of intense racial calls when I was at NeighborWorks America, exploring the murder of George Floyd. It's almost like an equity statement of a corporation. You know, as soon as George Floyd died, you have all these banks and all these corporations roll out these massively wonderful equity statements. And I cannot tell you how much they were panned in those conversations. It's like, well, the board's all white. The CEO, senior leadership is all white. In fact, it's mostly male. And, you know, you can't even get a woman's voice in there. So what the heck does it matter? And so I come at this, I mean, kind of torn that at one level, I'm inspired by the words. At another level, I feel shocked at the lack of response overall. I'm a former priest. I'm laicized. And a lot of people knew that at work. Most people did. And people would come up to me and say, John, you know, when Black Lives Matter was happening, can't the local church say something? It said nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was silent. I could point them to this document, but nobody would have cared. So I'm just really mixed about all of this. I feel like all of us, and I'm guilty of this too, action doesn't match rhetoric. I appreciate the document. I appreciate the historic approach, but I just wish more people would take seriously this one line in the document. For me, that was really inspiring was, as bishops, we unequivocally state that racism is a life issue. How many see this as a life issue? I don't think a lot of us do.
Thank you, John. Does anyone else want to share what challenged him or her as you read the document?
Well,
So, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, I'd like to rejoin what John said. Visitation certainly had a response, you know, an active response to the demonstrations and the murder of George Floyd. You know, we went down to the plaza, we participated in that, tried to assist it. I'm not saying that makes us all good, but we tried to do something. I was also flabbergasted, I guess, at what I believe was the absolute lack of response by the diocese. I was, that kind of astounded me, and I can't explain it.
Well, thank you for your candor. Emmet, I think you wanted to mention something.
Yes. So I will say I knew about the letter, but I never read it until I reconnected with some of my visitation folk. But, you know, I was challenged by, and understand this is coming from an African-American who had a unique experience while, you know, growing up in what the Star called the worst zip code, going to visitation on public transportation. So I got to see two lives, if you will. I got to see, you know, the life of going to visitation, and some of my friends were Mission Hills and Linwood. But then I got on the public bus, 3 of them, and went back to my community. And I saw the challenges there. So it's 2 worlds, if you will. So I struggled with reading this and listening to the words, and, you know, it's overall, you know, they hit on, I think someone said aspirational, but I struggled with, and I think, Father, you kind of hit on it, the lack of no response from the diocese. And again, I'm going to be very candid and transparent, you know, growing up, and then as a young adult, I saw the diocese abandon the urban core, and particularly African Americans. You say, well, why do I say that? I look at, you know, as a little boy, you know, Sisters of Carondelet moving from Linwood and Prospect to 103rd and State Line, and leaving that blight and devastation in the urban community for years upon years. It's now the site of the Linwood Shopping Center. I struggled with in my own neighborhood. I grew up at 52nd in Brooklyn. My 87-year-old mom still lives there. But at 53rd in Woodland, which is 3 blocks away, I looked at Little Sisters of the Poor leave the community. I saw them leave a blighting influence there again for, you know, decades. And so to read this, I was not surprised by a lack of response to the diocese. You know, the diocese, in my mind, you know, did not facilitate keeping primarily African-American Catholic schools. So St. Joseph's, St. Martin de Porres, St. Francis, St. Teresa Little Flower. I mean, to where, you know, if I wanted a Catholic education, I can't get in my own community. I had to travel to visitation where no one looked like me. There was no diversity in the school. You know, to take that further, you know, I didn't have my first teacher of color till I was in college. So I struggled with seeing these words, and I kept asking myself as I was reading that, you know, they said they have a subsequent ad hoc committee on racism and race, and, you know, they would make all the resources available, and I struggled to see where those resources were. I mean, so that was a struggle for me.
Thank you, Emmet, again, for your candor. Does anyone else want to articulate a challenge, or would we like to move on to the next question?
I would just say I'm really struck by what Emmet and Father said. I think it's especially interesting sort of in light of the document's call, I think, for a moment of atonement, and that perhaps, you know, the document sort of acknowledged that we haven't had that, but maybe there was an opportunity for the church, for the diocese to have that moment, and they just maybe didn't step up and embrace it in the way that they could have potentially.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would say that it's still going on. That right now there is a in the deanery of that includes St. Teresa Little Flower, St. Monica's, and St. Louis parishes. They're all being looked at and scrutinized for what's in the best interest of the parishes and who they serve, and participating in that process at St. Teresa, it feels like one parish at least will be closing, and it's more of that, instead of the focus being, what can we do here to beef this up, to be more vibrant? It's kind of funny to be reading this in this context and experiencing really what the diocese and the chancery is leading right now, down a completely different direction and road, just furthering what Emmet was talking about here. It seems very misguided or unfortunate.
Well, Father Brad, it seems like we just had this conversation earlier this evening that people from these communities, St. Monica's and stuff, were saying to our community, if you're going to step up, if you're going to be present, if you're going to be here, we need you to be here. We need you to be our ally. You need to be a part of what we're trying to accomplish. And as you guys were saying, it seems as though we're talking about this document as it's aspirational. And the next question is we're talking about is what do we feel inspired to do? If there's no action steps taken, if this document is, as we keep talking about right now, if it's great in theory, or it sounds like a nice thing they said, but there's no action steps that are going to be taken, then is there a purpose to this document? So I guess that's my question right now.
Well, can I respond to that, Lorraine?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Empty a little bit of my bail here, I guess. The lack of diocesan response to the George Floyd murder and related events truly does befuddle me. The diocesan, essentially the closure of diocesan school apostolates in the center of the city, I actually know something about, because for about 9 years I was in the chancery while some of those places were being closed. And I know that the diocese tried very hard and indeed raised millions of dollars and invested them in those schools to try to keep many of them open. Schools are tremendously expensive. I mean, just astoundingly expensive. And they got to where they could not do it. Fortunately, there are still some Catholic educational apostolates in the urban core, but they're run by religious communities, not the diocese. I know that this bishop, and I think it was true of Bishop Finn also, would very much like to have the Catholic elementary school reopen in the urban core. I know they would like to do that. But the amount of money it takes is kind of staggering. It's a lot. Now, moving on to what you said, Nancy. Just my opinion. I think about the history of our country, the history of racism. We fought far and away the most costly and bloody war in this nation's history, essentially about the issues of racism, and it did not fix things. We witnessed jurisprudence from Dred Scott to Plessy versus Ferguson to Brown versus Board of Education. I don't know that it essentially moved the needle. We've thrown a mountain range of money at a canyon of social injustice, and it certainly has not essentially fixed the problem. We even elected an African-American president twice, and the problem is still with us. In my opinion, and this gets back to what Sandy said, what will really begin to chew this issue down is relationship building. I've said this to our school. I want our people to know about Louis Armstrong. I want them to know about Duke Ellington. I want them to know about Bob Gibson and Chuck Berry and, you know, and Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King. I want them to know that Black America is America. You know, I want them to be exposed to the genius of African Americans. I think we need to go to St. Monica's a lot more than once. I think that we need to count it a step in the right direction when we can look over the back fence and find that our neighborhood is a Black couple. Frankly, I think what will solve the racism issue more than anything is what the sociologists call assimilation. You know, when my white daughter marries your Black son, that will do it. When people begin to get comfortable that way with that kind of relationship building, then racism will begin to wane. But until we expose ourselves to each other along those lines, I think we already know that there are not enough bullets and there's not enough money to fix the problem.
Okay. Thank you, Father Brad. I'd like to ask, I think, Nancy, you've sort of opened the door to the next question. So I'm going to ask you to reflect on, having read the letter, did it compel you? Did you feel compelled to act? And if so, what shape would that action take?
Some of the ways that I think for me, actions are with my students is being, you know, open with them and trying to, you know, just teach them about all, you know, how we treat people, and just all different types of people in America, as Father was talking about, you know, the history of our country, the history of America. And also for me personally, I think it's also trying to be, it's standing up. It's, I have a history of when I was younger of when people would make, you know, comments or what they called jokes or things, of just not saying anything or letting it slide, and just not doing that. You know, if I find, you know, if something is, you know, offensive and people say things, is standing up more. That's kind of where I'm at in my life now, of, you know, saying what's on my mind in terms of, if I think that you are offending somebody, or if you are saying something that is not right, speaking up rather than just taking the easy way out and ignoring it. So I think for me, that's the inspiration.
I guess I want to follow up with a question is, do you find yourself feeling discomfort doing that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Sometimes, absolutely. Especially when sometimes it is, you know, could be members of, you know, family or friends, but, and so, yeah, it can be uncomfortable, but I think at the same time, it's an example I want to show for my children. And I want something for them to always feel comfortable, and to that their mother has their back also.
Okay, Emmett, could I ask you to share your thoughts about what sort of action this might have compelled you to take, and what form that would be?
Sure. It starts with, you know, as someone, as John knows the work, you know, many of the issues that were brought up in the letter, I deal with every day. You know, access to capital. You know, Kansas City, we are polite racist. You know, very polite about it. You know, even we protested politely on the plaza. And so what it really compelled me to do is to keep having an open mind, and have dialogue with folk I probably hadn't had dialogue with in a long time. You know, it compels me because I did have such a unique upbringing, and now I choose to work in a, you know, African-American, proudly African-American side of town. I don't get the luxury, so just probably going to offend some of your listeners. I don't get the luxury of get to stay in Brookside and not go past 63rd Street. I am compelled to engage all throughout the city. I'm compelled to not only be the only one in the room, as I was so often many times, and to start explaining how that feels and the challenges that presents. So for me, and I was also challenged to, even though I knew it, to look at the experiences of my other brown brethren, Native Americans. We hardly ever talk about Native Americans, but their struggles, especially during this time of COVID, are far more greater than what the media and what the press is talking about. It compelled me to reach out to some of my Muslim brothers and understand what it is to be Muslim in America. We still have not moved past looking at them oftentimes with a side eye. So what it made me to do is to do what I did this morning. I was out to my old high school rockers, talking to a bunch of freshmen, talking about my experience during Black History Month, on my experiences and how those experiences shaped me, how they shaped the work that I do. So making sure that I don't take for granted my Blackness and share that experience with folk who may not know what it is for the experiences of being Black in Kansas City and Black in America. Because oftentimes folk will say this to me, I get this a lot. Well, Emmett, you and your wife, you've made it. What does that mean? Until 2 years ago, I had never gotten pulled over by the police and gotten a violation or talking to sitting in my car. I always had to get out of my car. Doesn't matter if I was in a sweatsuit or a suit. And so while you all may not understand that, that is taxing. It is taxing to be African-American in America. And so making sure I share those experiences with folk like you all so that you can begin to have a glimpse and to begin to understand what it's like, the challenges of Black and brown folk in this country.
Thank you, Emmet. Does anyone else care to mention how reading this might have inspired him or her to act?
This is Kara. I would just say those are really insightful comments, and I think really helpful and challenging to me. I think to put a finer point on Nancy's comment, I think it's even at maybe a more rudimentary level sometimes than speaking up when someone says something challenging, but just to kind of reiterate Sandy's earlier idea that it's reaching out to people to have a challenging conversation. I think maybe sort of in this idea that we've got certain companies issuing statements that may feel less than genuine, and you don't see sort of this action. I think it's sometimes a little too easy to feel like you might say something wrong or potentially not get it all quite right. And I think that we have to sort of humbly, like the letter calls for, humbly put that aside and try to focus on learning and personal growth, even at sort of like you might lose a little bit of your own personal pride, but there's so much to be gained, and you're going to have, it's just, I don't know, I've challenged myself to realize I'm going to have to feel uncomfortable and sort of talk about things that I'm not used to talking about, even if it's less intense than what Nancy's saying. It's just listening to things that are hard to hear and hard to think about, sort of what Emmet is saying happening in my own city where I live, some of those examples, and really just kind of feeling that and dwelling on that and seeing what you can do differently.
Great. Thank you, Kara. I think I'd like to move on to the last question, and this is sort of optional. when we consider this issue of racism, would any of you like to comment on how or perhaps whether your profession is addressing racism as an issue today?
Lorraine, listen, let me go ahead and take that one.
Okay.
Every single day for 12 hours a day, that's all we do in some form or another. We provide economic opportunity to the underserved community, rather that's housing, rather that's access to capital, rather that's providing offices to small Black and brown and women businesses, rather that's affecting policy at the city, state, and federal level. Talking about, and access to capital is big, because I asked the question of our chamber as I was asked to speak, and I said, Kansas City is known for being a fantastic entrepreneurial city. But can anybody tell me how many African-American businesses were started at Easter Troost? Nobody kept that stat, but we are constantly trying to, and Troost is now transforming itself. But, we all talk about what should happen in this other area that many of us don't even go visit. So every day, that's the whole essence of what, as John opened up his comments with, a community development corporation does. We happen to be one of the largest ones probably in the region, but every single day, that is at the forefront of what I do, and hopefully empowering and changing the landscape of Kansas City on the east side particularly.
Thank you, Emmet. Does anyone else want to share what his or her profession might be doing?
I will just say from sitting on the
Sandy.
court, this is Sandy, yeah. Sitting as a judge on the court and being involved in legal education, continuing legal education, that I think that the Bar Association and the Missouri Bar has done a good job of requiring some continuing ed on anti-bias, eliminating bias, and educating CLE classes on implicit bias, and being aware of it, recognizing it in ourselves, in judges who sit on the bench, and things that go on in courtrooms that affect people, that affect their view and their experience of justice or injustice in our system. And I just do want to say this about George Floyd's death was not the last man who was murdered by police. Recently, in December or November, there was a trial in Missouri, in Jackson County, against a police officer who was charged with the homicide of a Black man who was shot backing his own pickup truck into his own garage, and was unarmed when he was shot and killed by a policeman who entered his property without having any lawful standing or reason to be there. And the case was tried before a judge because the defendant police officer waived a jury. And it took a great deal of courage for that judge to convict and find that officer guilty in that homicide, in that manslaughter case. And I just think now that in the last few days, there has been another police shooting. They go on a lot. We're more aware of them, and thank God the media now reports them so that they're in front of our faces. But I feel like our prayers of the faithful in our community should address and own and pray for racial justice, and even name these incidents when they occur, to at least put it in front of the people who are there, who are open to hearing this, and who are there seeking God in their lives, And it should be a part of our prayer. If it offends some people as being too political, too bad. I think it has to be our prayer. When I'm in a parish that prays those prayers weekly, I feel like they should be everywhere. We should all be having prayers for changes in policing practices, in the access to the justice system, all of that stuff. It should be part of our prayers that should challenge us every week to what's really going on in our own community, in our own city. So I think that's one change that Visitation could make that would move us along and keep it in our on our windshields at all times.
Thank you, Sandy. Is there anyone else who would like to comment about what his or her profession is doing? We're getting close to the end of this discussion, so would anyone like to?
Yeah, right before I left NeighborWorks America, I mean, we were really doubling down in terms.
This is John speaking.
I'm sorry, this is John.
Okay, that's okay.
Before I left NeighborWorks America in August, we were really doubling down on how can we make more equitable grants and really dealing with a lot of the bigger foundations, you know, the Bill Gates of the world and others and stuff. And it's not as easy as you might think. But I think there was a real will and desire to go in that way. We've certainly in the last round of grants that I was involved with, put an equity lens on many of our grants and tried to look at what is not what is just asked, but what is needed within a community. I guess for myself, you know, I think everybody's approaching this at such different levels. I mean, so many people just say I don't hate anybody, therefore I'm not racist. But the institutional racism that is present within our country, I would just say, I know many will deny that and live in that kind of a bubble. I think if you haven't read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, that is a tremendous book that talks about racism, institutional racism, at least from a housing perspective, and how redlining was really the instrument of our government, not necessarily banks after World War II. And housing is sort of the mother lobe of how most people's wealth is accumulated within this country. So by putting a whole group, racial group at such a disadvantage, it's no wonder the wealth gap is what it is, I think.
Thank you, John. Thank you for sharing that. I want to wrap up our conversation, and I guess I want to thank you all on behalf of the people from the Faith Formation team and the Racial Justice Committee who sort of took this initiative and ran with it and hoped that we could create podcast episodes that really sort of mind the opinions and the perspective of a number of parishioners. And so I really appreciate all that you've shared this evening, and also just the candor, I believe, and the specificity of your comments have really enriched this episode. And I just want to tell you how much we appreciate it. We've come to the conclusion of the first episode of Open Wide Our Hearts, and we hope you will join us for the next episode in which, excuse me, I'll be talking with visitation parents who have chosen to support the Cristo Rey program at Visitation School. I want to thank Nancy, Emmet, Kara, Father Brad, John, and Joanne, and for participating this evening. And I hope that the Faith Formation team will hear your responses to this episode. There will be other episodes, and we appreciate any comments. So please feel free to comment. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lorraine.